I can finally breathe for a few moments. 2 weeks have passed since my last broadcast. The temporary refuge I found in these remote mountains has served my purpose well. The cold early morning air seeps through the cracks of this abandoned cabin, but at least here I have enough signal coverage and time to share what I discovered. My name is Father Thomas. Those of you who follow my journey know that I have dedicated the last few years to exposing hidden truths of the Holy See. While recovering from the wound in my leg, I was contacted by someone I never expected, Sister Agatha, a 68-year-old nun who served for 4 decades in the highest administrative spheres of the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life. This is the Vatican department that oversees all Catholic convents globally. This courageous nun handed me a digital archive containing 343 documented accounts of nuns who tried to report internal abuse, stories that the Church systematically silenced. The musty smell of this cabin constantly reminds me of the odor of corruption that permeates certain corridors of the Vatican. Those same corridors where decisions about the fates of problematic nuns are made without witnesses. There is a complex system within the Catholic structure specifically to ensure that these stories never reach the public. A system that has operated in the shadows for centuries, using tactics ranging from forced transfers to complete disappearances. My hands shake as I organize these documents, not because of the biting cold that penetrates through the cracks in the walls, but because of the weight of these revelations. With every page I turn, I encounter stories of women who dedicated their lives to God, only to discover the hell created by men within the hallowed walls. Leave the word witness in the comments. This not only helps this content reach more people, but also lets me know how many of you actually received this message despite attempts to silence us. The connection is unstable. I need to be quick. What I discovered about the Ancilla Domini protocol and so-called special spiritual hospices will shake the centuries-old structures built on the forced silence of these women. The story of Sister Beatrice, found in mysterious circumstances after her denunciation of an influential bishop, is just the beginning of this revelation. Sister Beatrice's story is where we need to start. Found in a psychiatric hospital on the Italian-Austrian border, this 41-year-old nun had been a respected librarian at the Vatican Secret Archive. Your crime meticulously document cases of financial abuse in Italian convents. The empty eyes with which he stared at me during our brief clandestine visit still haunt me on the cold nights of this isolated cabin. They use the sacraments against us, Father Thomas, she whispered, her shaking hands holding mine. When I began questioning, I was told that my confessions would be specially monitored. Documents provided by Sister Agatha confirm this terrifying pattern. The use of confession as a tool of psychological control. Imagine the devastating impact on the psyche of a deeply religious woman being told that her most intimate sacrament would be used to monitor her institutional loyalty. Let me detail how the silencing system that I discovered through these internal documents works. When a nun attempts to report any abuse, whether physical, psychological, financial, or sexual, she faces a structure designed not to investigate the truth, but to preserve institutional reputation at all costs. The first level of containment always begins with spiritual manipulation. You are being tempted by the divider. This is a test of your obedience. Humility requires acceptance of suffering. These phrases appear consistently in 82% of the reports I analyzed. If the nun persists, what an internal document called Directives for Crisis Situations in Female Religious Communities, dated 1997, clinically calls therapeutic isolation begins. This document, which I found among Sister Agatha's files, describes with alarming bureaucratic precision how to separate the problematic religious woman from potential allies within the community. The language used is particularly disturbing in its coldness. An excerpt translated directly from Italian. When a nun demonstrates persistent tendencies to question hierarchical authority or internal practices, immediate transfer to an extended spiritual retreat is recommended, preferably in a distant location with restricted communication. This separation allows for appropriate spiritual intervention without contamination of the broader community. Sister Veronica's case perfectly exemplifies this protocol in action. This 37-year-old Filipino nun documented a scheme to embezzle funds intended for orphans in Manila. When she presented her findings to Mother Superior, she was immediately sent to spiritual retreat in a remote convent in the mountainous region of Mindanao. The transfer document, which is in my possession, cites the need for further vocational development as the official justification. 3 weeks later, Sister Veronica's family received a letter, supposedly written by her, formally renouncing her religious vows and declaring her intention to start a new life away from the community. The handwriting, according to the forensic analysis I discreetly ordered, shows significant inconsistencies with other documents written by the nun. Sister Veronica was never seen again. The second level of the system is even more disturbing: systematic psychological discreditation. In 64 of the documented cases, nuns who persisted in reporting were subjected to psychological assessments conducted by professionals appointed directly by ecclesiastical authorities. The result? Diagnoses ranging from histrionic personality disorder to religious psychosis, a term that, importantly, does not exist in modern psychiatric literature. I found a particularly alarming form among the documents. Titled Vocational Stability Assessment, it features pre-filled fields with terms such as paranoid tendencies, obsessive fixation, distorted interpretation of reality, and manipulative behavior. According to Sister Agatha, these forms are distributed to specific psychiatrists with clear instructions about the expected outcome. What makes this system so effective is its ability to operate under the guise of legitimate pastoral care. Each step is carefully camouflaged as genuine concern for the nun's spiritual and psychological well-being. The temperature is dropping here in the mountains. Dampness penetrates the bones as these revelations penetrate the soul. As I warm my hands over this little lamp, I think of the hundreds of women whose voices have been systematically silenced, not for speaking lies, but for insisting on the truth. One of the most disturbing documents I received details what happens when the first 2 levels of containment fail, when a nun persists despite isolation and attempts to discredit her. This is where the system reveals its darkest face, something many would refuse to believe. The document, Protocol for Cases of Persistent Insubordination in Women's Religious Communities, dated 2003 and stamped Strictly Confidential, Designated Authorities Only, describes the establishment of special facilities in 5 remote locations around the world. These places, euphemistically called houses of intensive spiritual renewal, are effectively detention facilities disguised as retreats. Sister Julia, one of the few who managed to escape from one of these facilities in South America, described the internal regime to me during our clandestine interview: forced medication, solitary confinement, justified as intensive contemplation, mandatory daily confessions, and what she called theological reprogramming, grueling sessions where they are repeatedly confronted with texts about religious obedience and the spiritual consequences of sowing discord in the body of Christ. Most alarming, of the 22 nuns I was able to identify as having been sent to these facilities between 2007 and 2019, only 9 returned to regular life. Of the remaining, 8 remained indefinitely in these facilities. 3 were officially exempt from voting due to mental instability, and 2 died from causes recorded as natural, although without independent autopsies. Sister Agatha's reports include a financial dimension that partially explains the institutional determination to silence complaints. Many of the documented cases involve discoveries of massive financial embezzlement at convents that operate schools, hospitals, and charities. An exemplary case, Sister Gabriella, an accountant trained before entering religious life, discovered that only 23% of donations received for an orphanage run by her order in Central America actually reached the children. The rest was redirected through a complex network of foundations and administrative costs to accounts controlled by diocesan authorities. When she compiled evidence and presented it to the local bishop, she was transferred within 48 hours to an emergency vocational discernment retreat. 3 months later, her order announced that she had voluntarily left religious life to attend to urgent family matters. Her family, who I interviewed secretly, claimed to have never had any contact with her since. The numbers are dizzying. An internal financial report from the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life estimates that nuns represent a workforce that, if paid at market rates, would cost the Church more than €2 billion annually in Europe alone. Instead, most receive only basic subsistence while working tirelessly in church-run hospitals, schools, and charities. Any threat to this economic model is treated extremely severely. A confidential memo I obtained through Sister Agatha, dated 2014, and signed by a cardinal whose name I must withhold for security, explicitly instructs: reports of financial irregularities in institutions run by female orders must be handled with utmost discretion and immediate containment. These matters must not, under any circumstances, reach secular authorities or the press. My breath forms little clouds of vapor in this cold shelter as I examine one of the most disturbing documents in the collection, a report on solved cases. Bureaucratic language cannot completely mask the cruel reality it represents. The document classifies nuns into categories: R1 for those who accepted guidance and returned to the community in full compliance, R2 for those who required prolonged intervention but eventually demonstrated vocational suitability, and finally, the R3 category, coldly defined as cases where reintegration was considered unfeasible, requiring permanent alternative solutions. Leave the word silence in the comments. It's not just a gesture of support, it's an acknowledgement of the voices that have been silenced. With each comment, I will know that one more person has become aware of this hidden truth. The risks I take in revealing this information are considerable. The Catholic Church, as an ancient institution, has resources and influence that few can imagine. But these women, who have dedicated their lives to serving others in the name of their faith, deserve to have their stories known. The system that silenced them must be exposed, not to destroy faith, but to purify it. The risks I take in revealing this information are considerable, but the truth needs to emerge from the shadows. As I examine the documents scattered around me in this isolated cabin, I feel the weight of the responsibility I carry. Each roll represents a life, a silenced voice, a woman who believed she was serving God, only to discover she was trapped in a system designed to exploit her faith and dedication. To truly understand the magnitude of this silencing system, we need to examine its structure in detail. The perverse ingenuity lies precisely in how he takes advantage of the religious women's own spirituality and sacred vows against themselves. The vow of obedience, one of the 3 pillars of religious life, along with poverty and chastity, is systematically manipulated as the first line of institutional defense. When a nun files a complaint, the immediate invocation of this vow transforms her act of courage into a supposed sin of pride and disobedience. The documentation I have reveals a training manual for Mother Superiors, coded as Directrices para Situaciones de Crisis Comunitarias. Guidelines for Community Crisis Situations, which explicitly instructs when a sister brings charges against ecclesiastical authorities or community practices, the first response should be a direct appeal to her vow of obedience. The nun is reminded that her personal discernment is subordinate to the legitimate authority of the Church, and that questioning this authority constitutes a serious violation of her sacred commitments. In most cases, this initial spiritual pressure is sufficient. The fear of spiritual condemnation, of betraying Christ by questioning his earthly representatives, causes a devastating inner conflict. Sister Luciana, a former Brazilian nun I interviewed safely, described this moment with painful precision. It's as if your very soul is being ripped in two. On the one hand, you know what you witnessed. On the other, there's all your spiritual training telling you that to doubt is to succumb to demonic temptation. If this first barrier is not enough, the protocol moves to a more systematic level. Examine with me this particularly disturbing document dated 2005, originating from the Vatican's Department for Consecrated Life, but circulated only among select bishops. The document, entitled Procedures for Sensitive Cases in Women's Religious Institutes, establishes the following steps with bureaucratic precision. When a nun maintains harmful allegations despite initial spiritual guidance, it is strongly recommended that she be immediately removed for a period of reflection in a community far from the original, preferably in a different ecclesiastical province. This separation, presented as an opportunity for spiritual deepening, allows for appropriate intervention without risk of contamination of the broader community. Clinical language barely disguises the reality. Forced isolation as a silencing tactic. Discernment retreats often take place in specific locations that effectively function as spiritual detention centers. I identified 27 such globally distributed sites, from the remote Uzès monastery in France to the isolated retreat house in the mountainous region of Chiapas in Mexico. The case of Sister Elisabetta perfectly illustrates this mechanism at work. This 42-year-old Italian nun, a trained nurse, documented questionable practices at the hospital run by her order in Naples, including systematic diversion of donated medicines and falsification of financial records. When he presented his findings to Mother Superior in April 2017, he initially received evasive responses. When she persisted, she was informed in less than 48 hours that she had been selected for a special spiritual opportunity, a 3-month retreat in a convent in the Apennines. The transfer document, which I obtained through my contacts, clearly specifies no external communications permitted during the discernment period, including family correspondence, to ensure the integrity of the spiritual process. Sister Elisabetta effectively disappeared for 97 days. When he returned, according to the testimony of colleagues I managed to interview anonymously, he seemed like a completely different person, quiet, submissive, refusing to discuss any aspect of his spiritual experience, and changing the subject whenever the hospital was mentioned. When isolation fails, and there are religious women of extraordinary spiritual resilience who resist this pressure, the system advances to its most insidious phase, systematic psychological discreditation. This is the most disturbing aspect of the entire structure that I discovered. One particularly revealing document I have in my possession is a standardized form titled Vocational Stability and Psychological Aptitude Assessment. At first glance, it seems like a legitimate clinical tool. However, careful analysis reveals something deeply disturbing. The form is structured to virtually guarantee negative psychological diagnoses. Among the evaluation criteria listed are vague but stigmatizing items such as interpretive rigidity of doctrines, excessive attachment to personal perceptions, and resistance to superior guidance. Most alarmingly, the document includes a section titled primary indicators of instability that contains pre-formulated diagnoses, including histrionic personality disorder, paranoid tendencies fixated on institutional conspiracies, and the particularly revealing persistent vocational maladjustment syndrome, a term that does not exist in any recognized psychiatric literature. Dr. Helena Vasquez, a psychiatrist who worked for 7 years at a nun-run clinic in Spain before resigning over ethical objections, confirmed to me in an anonymous interview, "I received constant pressure to use these specific forms in evaluations of nuns referred for community adjustment issues. When I examined the cases in more detail, I discovered a disturbing pattern. Many of these women had simply questioned administrative or financial practices at their institutions. The use of these fabricated psychiatric diagnoses is strategically brilliant in its cruelty. Once a nun officially receives a diagnosis of mental instability, any subsequent reports can easily be dismissed as manifestations of her condition. Even more disturbing, these diagnoses often justify forced medication. The case of Sister Madeleine, a Canadian nun who worked on a mission in Africa, exemplifies this terrible practice. After documenting systematic misappropriation of funds intended for a drinking water project, she underwent a psychological evaluation by a doctor appointed by the diocese. The resulting diagnosis: delusional disorder with fixation on institutional conspiracy theories. Based solely on this diagnosis, with no second opinion or possible recourse, she was placed on a forced medication regimen with potent antipsychotics for 14 months. "I lived in a constant mental fog," he reported to me after managing to leave the order. "I could barely formulate coherent thoughts, much less defend myself. I realized that was precisely the objective, to transform myself into a living confirmation of the diagnosis that had been imposed on me. If the nun somehow resists the first 2 phases, she then faces the third, and often definitive stage, punitive transfer to what I can only describe as prison convents. Specific remote facilities where problematic nuns are effectively detained under the guise of special missionary assignments." Sister Agatha's documents revealed the existence of at least 14 of these facilities, strategically distributed in regions with minimal external supervision, from the Peruvian Amazon to the mountainous regions of Papua New Guinea. These facilities share revealing characteristics: extremely remote location, absence of means of communication, supervision by personnel specifically selected for institutional loyalty, and internal regimes that are exceptionally strict even by the standards of religious life. One of the most terrifying stories I have documented is that of Sister Constance, a Ugandan nun who reported sexual abuse committed by an influential priest against novices in her convent. After resisting the first 2 phases of the protocol, she was transferred to what was officially called a special contemplation mission in the mountains of Mindanao, Philippines, a region notorious for political instability and the presence of armed groups. The transfer document, which I obtained through confidential channels, specified indefinite assignment with no regular rotation anticipated, a complete violation of normal religious mission protocols that typically establish fixed periods of service. Even more revealing, the document included the instruction: external communications subject to prior pastoral review for regional security reasons, a euphemism for complete censorship. I was able to track Sister Constance's whereabouts through local contacts. After 5 years on this mission, she had developed multiple untreated health problems, including recurrent malaria. More significantly, she had been effectively cut off from any possibility of communication with the outside world, with her family only told that she was on a special prayer mission in a remote region. What makes this 3-pronged system of silencing so devastatingly effective is its appearance of spiritual legitimacy. Each step is carefully disguised as genuine concern for the nun's spiritual and vocational well-being. Isolation is presented as an opportunity for spiritual deepening. Psychological assessment is classified as integral monitoring of vocational health. The punitive transfer is coded as special missionary assignment for unique talents. This spiritual camouflage makes it virtually impossible for outside observers, or even for religious women without direct experience, to recognize the systematic nature of these actions. Each isolated case can be explained as the specific situation of a particular nun. It is only when one examines the full pattern across hundreds of cases, as I was able to do thanks to Sister Agatha's documents, that the true institutionalized structure becomes undeniably visible. The lamp illuminating these documents is beginning to fade, as is the broadcast signal in this isolated haven. Leave the word exposition in the comments so that I know that this message is reaching you despite the interference. Each comment represents a crack in the wall of silence that has protected this system for generations. As I reorganize my equipment and ensure that this transmission is not being traced, I need to emphasize a crucial point. This system is not a historical relic or isolated anomaly. The most recent cases I have documented have literally occurred within the last few months. One of them, which I may discuss in our next broadcast, involves a young Brazilian nun who disappeared under extremely questionable circumstances after documenting a money laundering scheme involving international donations. As I wait for the storm to subside outside, the wind howling through the cracks in this cabin reminds me of the silent screams of the women whose stories I'm about to share. The young Brazilian nun I mentioned is just the tip of a terrifying iceberg. The documentation I have in my hands reveals a systemic pattern of silencing that spans continents and decades. The 343 documented cases I received from Sister Agatha form an archive of ecclesiastical horror that kept me up at night for weeks. I spent whole nights by the light of this lamp, classifying, analyzing, and checking every detail. 27 of these stories stand out not only for their brutality, but for the final fate of these women. I will share some of them, changing only information that could identify them to protect those who, miraculously, are still alive. I start with what I called case number 112. Sister Cécile, 32, served in a convent in the Burgundy region of France. Trained in accounting before entering religious life, she kept meticulous records of donations received by her order for charitable projects in West Africa. In January 2018, during the annual account reconciliation, he discovered alarming discrepancies. Only 23% of the funds raised actually reached the intended recipients. The file contains his handwritten notes, pages and pages of carefully compared financial records, with red markings highlighting suspicious transfers to unidentified accounts. Cécile documented everything with the precision of a professional auditor, including dates, amounts and names of those responsible for approvals. On February 17, 2018, he formally presented his findings to Mother Superior, attaching more than 40 pages of supporting documentation. What happened next follows the pattern I have already described. In less than 24 hours, she was told she would receive a special opportunity for spiritual deepening, an emergency retreat at an isolated house of prayer in the French Alps. Its files were confiscated as administrative materials belonging to the order. Cécile, however, had secretly scanned all the documentation and sent copies to her brother, a lawyer in Paris, with instructions to make them public if anything happened to her. 3 days after her arrival at the retreat, Sister Cécile was found dead in her cell. The official cause, suicide by hanging. The narrative quickly constructed by religious authorities suggested a young nun burdened by excessive spiritual scruples and anxiety related to her responsibilities. What the church did not expect was the persistence of Cécile's brother, who managed to order a second independent autopsy. I have the full report in my hands, and the details are deeply disturbing. Defensive markings on wrists and hands, unexplained neck bruises inconsistent with self-inflicted hanging. More alarmingly, traces of diazepam at significantly high levels in the blood, a substance that was not in the original toxicology report. When the brother began pushing for a criminal investigation, he received an unusual visitor, two Vatican representatives offering pastoral assistance in his time of mourning. During this visit, he was reminded of the legal complexities involving ecclesiastical jurisdictions and the negative impact that unfounded allegations could have on the charity his sister loved so much. 2 weeks later, after a substantial anonymous contribution to his law firm, the case was quietly dropped. Case number 2237 reveals another side of this silencing system. Sister Mercedes, 41, served in a convent near Medellin, Colombia. Graduated in psychology before her religious vocation, she worked directly with novices and postulants on their initial path to consecrated life. In 2016, 5 novices separately confided in him about experiences of abuse during special private confessions conducted by a regional bishop who regularly visited the convent. The pattern was consistent. The bishop insisted on face-to-face confessions, contrary to the normal practice of using partitioned confessionals. During these sessions, according to reports, there were inappropriate touches justified as special blessings and invasive questions about physical purity that deviated substantially from normal confessional practice. Sister Mercedes carefully documented these reports, maintaining the young women's anonymity, and initially followed ecclesiastical protocol by presenting her concerns to Mother Superior. She was immediately instructed not to give credence to the exalted imaginations of young people in spiritual formation. When she insisted that the pattern of independent reporting suggested a real problem, she was removed from her role of monitoring novices and assigned to the convent laundry. Determined to protect the young women in her care, Mercedes managed to send a detailed letter directly to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome, the department responsible for abuse cases. 3 weeks later, instead of investigators, 2 clergymen appointed to carry out an emergency vocational assessment appeared. The diagnosis resulting from this assessment would be comical if it were not tragic. Religious schizophrenia with paranoid tendencies manifested in fixation on imagined abuse. A diagnosis that, as an expert in psychology, Mercedes knew perfectly well did not exist in any recognized psychiatric manual. Based solely on this diagnosis, without any independent assessment, Mercedes was transferred to a spiritual nursing home on the remote border between Colombia and Peru. Official documents classified the transfer as specialized treatment for vocational restoration. The reality, according to testimonies I obtained from local officials, is very different. Forced medication, confinement in a restricted area, and constant supervision that makes any external communication impossible. Sister Mercedes has been effectively detained in this facility for 5 years. Her family occasionally receives letters supposedly written by her, stating that she is in the process of spiritual healing and grateful for the care received. Forensic handwriting, analysis that I commissioned discreetly, indicates significant inconsistencies with his previous writing. The bishop in question, meanwhile, has been promoted to an administrative position at the Vatican. The novices who originally reported the abuse have either left religious life or, disturbingly, currently deny any memory of their original allegations. Case number 298 exemplifies how not even decades of exemplary service protect a nun when she threatens to expose institutional abuses. Sister Leon, 56, served for more than 3 decades in a convent in Mindanao, Philippines. As Master of Novices, the nun responsible for training candidates for consecrated life, she was deeply respected for her wisdom and compassion. For years, Sister Leon noticed a disturbing pattern of exceptionally harsh disciplinary practices meted out to novices. particularly by 3 older sisters in positions of authority. These practices included punitive food deprivations, public humiliations, and even physical punishments such as kneeling in grains of rice for hours, methods explicitly prohibited by the order's own regulations. Initially, Lian attempted to address these issues internally through appropriate channels. It was repeatedly silenced with justifications of established formative traditions and the need for rigorous discipline for contemporary vocations. For 3 years, he meticulously documented each incident, including dates, nature of abuse, victims and perpetrators, creating a detailed archive of more than 200 cases. In September 2019, after a novice was hospitalized with severe dehydration resulting from food punishment, Lian decided she could no longer remain silent. He prepared a comprehensive report aimed directly at the Apostolic Nuncio, the Vatican ambassador to the Philippines, deliberately bypassing the local hierarchy who had ignored his concerns. On the day I planned to submit the report, Sister Lian disappeared. For 3 days, no information about his whereabouts was provided to the community, only vague announcements about urgent need for spiritual assistance. When she finally reappeared, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in Manila, miles away. Sisters who managed to visit her reported a shocking transformation, sedated to the point of barely recognizing visitors, with incoherent speech and apparently no clear memory of recent events. The official diagnosis, signed by a doctor with strong ecclesiastical connections: nervous breakdown induced by excessive ascetic practices and vocational exhaustion. The file containing his meticulous documentation has completely disappeared. When asked about their whereabouts, the convent administration simply stated that disturbed personal materials were destroyed as part of the recommended therapeutic process. Sister Lian has remained under treatment for almost 3 years. Recent visitors report that she now seems strangely docile, often repeating that she was confused and imagining problems that didn't exist. The doctor who signs your current prescription for potent antipsychotics is the sister of the local bishop. These 3 cases are just examples of a systematic pattern that I have identified. Leave a like on this video now. This simple gesture helps break the cycle of silence. Every view, every engagement is a small light in what has been centuries of darkness for these women. Other cases in the documents follow disturbingly the same script. Sister Teresa, 38 years old, who discovered irregularities in the international adoption processes managed by her order in Guatemala, found dead of natural causes without an autopsy. Sister Josephine, 44, who documented systematic sexual abuse of novices by a respected confessor in her Italian convent, diagnosed with delusional disorder and kept on forced medication for 4 years until her eventual release from vows due to mental ineptitude. Sister Catherine, 51, who questioned the disappearance of substantial funds earmarked for educational projects in the Congo, transferred to a special mission so remote that her family received no communication for more than 7 years. The pattern is undeniable. The system doesn't just silence these women, it systematically destroys them, using the very mechanisms of spiritual authority, psychological diagnosis, and institutional isolation to erase not just their voices, but their very credibility and, in extreme cases, their existence. All of these cases share another disturbing element: the almost complete absence of media coverage. While scandals involving priests eventually reach the press, the stories of these nuns remain largely unknown. This disparity in attention is not accidental, but the product of specific institutional factors. First, conventual structures are already inherently isolated from broader society, making the disappearance or departure of members much less visible. Second, the hierarchical nature of women's religious life creates multiple barriers to external denunciation. Third, and perhaps most significantly, nuns lack the institutional power and social connections that priests often possess. The confidential report from the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life that I obtained from Sister Agatha reveals another critical factor: specific guidelines for media management in cases of crises involving religious women. The document explicitly instructs authorities to emphasize emotional fragility, pressures of modern life on female vocations, and most disturbingly, hysterical tendencies, a term with deeply problematic sexist connotations. Leave a like on this video, not for me, but for them. For every woman who dedicated her life to serving others, only to find institutional silencing when she tried to stand up for the truth. Every like helps amplify these silenced voices. The documents I'm analyzing also reveal another disturbing pattern: the strategic use of spiritual threats as a control mechanism. Nuns who attempt to report abuse often face not only earthly consequences like fabricated transfers or diagnoses, but also spiritual manipulation. The documents I'm analyzing also reveal another disturbing pattern: the strategic use of spiritual threats as a control mechanism. Nuns who attempt to report abuse often face not only earthly consequences such as transferences or fabricated diagnoses, but also spiritual manipulation calculated to provoke profound existential terror. As I progress in this research, one question constantly haunts me: why? Why is there such an elaborate and ruthless system dedicated specifically to silencing whistleblowing nuns? What would justify such substantial resources and such extreme methods aimed at women who have dedicated their lives to the Church? The answer, as often happens in institutional investigations, follows the money. During my years investigating the hidden structures of the Church, I have never found a more consistent reason for institutional silencing than the protection of financial assets. The documents I obtained from Sister Agatha and other sources reveal a financial reality that few believers, and I suspect few of the nuns themselves, fully understand. Women's convents and women's religious orders represent an extraordinary source of revenue for the global Catholic Church. We are talking about a parallel economic system that functions largely without public oversight, conventional taxation, or standard labor legislation. I will detail how this hidden financial system works, based on the confidential documents I have at hand. The first and perhaps most fundamental pillar of this system is practically free labor. Unlike diocesan priests, who receive modest but real salaries, most nuns work full-time in schools, hospitals, orphanages, and other Catholic institutions, receiving only token compensation, often called stipends for personal needs, that rarely exceed 10% of the market value for equivalent professional roles. One particularly revealing document I discovered during my investigation is an internal memo from the Vatican Secretariat of State dated 2016, classified as strictly confidential, limited circulation. This paper presents a detailed economic analysis of the labor value of women's congregations in surprisingly clinically financial terms. The economic contribution of consecrated religious women through professional services provided to Catholic institutions represents an estimated operational savings of approximately 1.2 billion euros annually in European jurisdictions alone. When considering missionary territories and operations in the Americas, this value exceeds 3 billion euros annually in services that, if contracted in the secular market, would represent unsustainable operating costs for many institutions. To put into context what this means in practice, nuns with full medical training running, Catholic hospitals in rural regions of Africa receive monthly stipends of approximately $120, while secular doctors with identical qualifications would receive salaries 40 times higher. Religious women with master's and doctorate degrees running Catholic universities in Latin America receive subsistences of approximately $200 per month, compared to the salaries of secular academic administrators that would easily exceed $4,000 for the same responsibilities. This massive economic differential is not the result of a scarcity of resources. According to confidential financial documents I obtained, many of these institutions operate on substantial profit margins. The disparity exists because the system was structured from its inception to exploit these women's vow of poverty and spiritual dedication as a mechanism to maximize institutional revenues. The internal document goes even further, coldly analyzing the return on investment of different female religious orders. Congregations involved in educational and health apostolates continue to represent the most favorable rates of financial return, especially when contrasted with minimal training and maintenance costs. A typical consecrated religious represents an institutional investment of approximately $9,000 for initial formation and subsequent $4,800 annually for basic subsistence, while generating an average economic value of $42,000 annually through services provided. In corporate terms, each nun represents an asset, generating an annual return of approximately 500% on investment. Any commercial company would consider this an extraordinarily profitable business model. The second pillar of this hidden economic system involves the systematic transfer of property and inheritance. When a woman becomes a nun, her vows of poverty have concrete legal consequences. Everything she possesses at the time of her final vows, or will later possess through family inheritance, is legally directed to her religious order and consequently to the broader structure of the Church. A confidential document from the Vatican Secretariat of State that I obtained through my contacts estimates that this patrimonial transfer represents approximately $3.7 billion annually on a global scale. The document specifically notes heritage acquisition via female vocations continues to represent a significant mechanism for expanding institutional assets, particularly in regions where family heritage traditions remain strong. Asian jurisdictions such as the Philippines, India, and South Korea represent areas of particular strategic interest in this regard, given the favorable combination of stable female vocational rates and family structures with significant intergenerational wealth transfer. Translated into straightforward language, the Vatican has strategically identified countries where women from relatively well-off families still choose religious life with significant frequency, resulting in substantial transfers of property and assets to the Church. One particularly illustrative case I documented was that of Sister Maria Consuelo, who came from a landowning family in Argentina. When he professed his final vows in 2011, he transferred rural properties valued at approximately $4.2 million to his religious order, assets he had recently inherited from his parents. The modest spiritual retreat house that was supposed to be built on these lands never materialized. Instead, the properties were discreetly sold 2 years later to an agribusiness corporation, with the proceeds being transferred directly to accounts controlled by the Vatican. When Sister Maria Consuelo later questioned the fate of her family heritage, she was quickly transferred to a remote mission in Bolivia. The third and perhaps most surprising pillar of this economic system is systematic tourist exploitation. Historic women's convents and monasteries have become exceptionally profitable tourist attractions with tickets, souvenir shops, and artisanal products produced by the nuns, generating substantial revenue streams with minimal taxation due to the religious status of these institutions. An internal memo from the Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life that I obtained lists 43 women's convents classified as priority facilities for developing tourist and heritage revenues, a list that includes historic facilities in Italy, Spain, France, and other popular tourist destinations. This document estimates that these 43 specific locations collectively generate more than 500 million euros annually in direct, non-taxable revenue. The particularly disturbing aspect of this tourist exploitation is the disparity between the revenue generated and the living conditions of the nuns who actually produce this income. Historic convents like Santa Catalina in Arequipa, Peru, or San Maurizio in Milan, Italy, welcome hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, generating millions in revenue, while the nuns who maintain these facilities and produce the products sold often live in conditions of extreme austerity, with limited access to adequate medical care and basic necessities. An internal financial report I discovered cynically details how to maximize this disparity. It is strongly recommended to visually preserve elements of traditional austerity in convent areas accessible to visitors, as these features contribute significantly to the authentic tourist experience and justify premium pricing structures. Simultaneously, investments in modernization should focus exclusively on commercial and tourist reception areas, thus maximizing the differential between external perception and actual operational expenditure. Translating this cold corporate language, keep the nuns visibly poor because tourists pay more to see religious authenticity while directing investment only to areas that generate direct revenue. Now, to fully understand the connection between this systematic financial exploitation and the silencing mechanisms I have documented, we need to examine what happens when religious women begin to question these economic arrangements. The case of Sister Andrea, a professional accountant before entering religious life, is particularly revealing. Assigned to manage the finances of a historic convent in Spain that received more than 300,000 annual visitors, she began to question why only 7% of tourist revenue was directed to the needs of the religious community, including medical care for elderly sisters, while 72% was transferred to diocesan administration without clear accountability. When he persisted with his questions, he received a surprise visit from a special auditor from the Vatican, who promptly identified irregularities in his administration. In less than 2 weeks, she was removed from her position, diagnosed with obsessive anxiety related to financial matters, and sent for specialized treatment at a remote facility. During his absence, all of the financial records he had compiled mysteriously disappeared during a computer systems upgrade. When Sister Andrea eventually returned after 3 months of intensive treatment, including forced medication with antipsychotics, she found a new financial administrator in place, a nun with no accounting training but with direct family connections to the diocesan administration. Similar patterns emerge consistently across the documents I analyzed. Of the 343 cases of silencing that I have, 157 directly involved religious women who questioned financial aspects of their institutions. In each case, the institutional response was swift, relentless, and followed the same protocols of isolation, discreditation, and eventual neutralization that I described earlier. One conclusion becomes inescapable. Any nun who questions this financial system, or worse yet, attempts to document irregularities, poses a direct threat to one of the global Catholic Church's most lucrative and least scrutinized revenue streams. The system of silencing I have documented does not exist primarily to protect powerful individuals or even theological doctrines. It exists to protect massive financial flows that fundamentally depend on the systematic economic exploitation of religious women. This economic exploitation is particularly effective precisely because it remains largely invisible both to the public and to many of the religious women themselves. The vow of poverty, originally conceived as a spiritual discipline of personal detachment, was institutionalized as a mechanism for unidirectional patrimonial transfer from the individual nun to the institution, never the other way around. The confidential financial memo I mentioned earlier includes a particularly revealing section titled "Challenges to the Sustainability of the Current Model." The document notes with concern that younger religious women, particularly those with prior professional training in financial or administrative areas, demonstrate worrying tendencies toward questioning traditional economic structures and requests for financial transparency that are incompatible with established practices of ecclesiastical wealth management. In other words, the Vatican is concerned that younger, more educated nuns are beginning to question why they work tirelessly in institutions that generate millions while often lacking basic medical care or dignified retirement. The document explicitly recommends early formative intervention to cultivate appropriate understanding of enshrined poverty and early identification of candidates with a propensity to question established administrative structures. Essentially, a system for identifying and neutralizing potential whistleblowers before they even profess their final votes. The calculated coldness of these documents deeply disturbs me as I examine them in this isolated cabin. Each page reveals a wider disparity between the public rhetoric of valuing religious women and the financial reality of their systematic economic exploitation. With every financial report I review, I see clearly how the Church's institutional economy fundamentally depends on this essentially unpaid work and this one-way transfer of assets. The light from this lamp is starting to fade, as is my transmission signal. Leave the word economy in the comments to confirm that you are receiving this information despite the interference that continues to try to block these transmissions. The next document I need to share is especially explosive, a specific Vatican protocol for dealing with nuns who try to establish contact with secular financial authorities, or the document specifies that these institutions must be established in locations that provide adequate isolation from disruptive secular influences and must operate under direct ecclesiastical, not state, jurisdiction to avoid inappropriate regulatory interference in internal spiritual matters. Even more disturbing, this document was never officially revoked. Despite numerous reforms in the Church in the following decades, the Ancilla Domini Protocol remains technically in force, protected by its status as a confidential internal document and the language barrier of archaic ecclesiastical Latin that few, even within the Church itself, can adequately translate. Yet even in the face of this meticulously designed oppressive system, there are stories of hope. Some extraordinarily resilient nuns managed to escape and rebuild their lives. During my investigation, I established contact with survivors of this system, women who not only regained their freedom, but found the courage to share their experiences, even under conditions of strict anonymity. We need to know their stories. Subscribe to the channel now to ensure you receive the next part of this investigation. The red button below doesn't just represent a gesture of support. It's a commitment to the truth these women fought so bravely to reveal. We need to know their stories. Subscribe to the channel now to ensure you receive the next part of this investigation. The red button below doesn't just represent a gesture of support. It's a commitment to the truth these women fought so bravely to reveal. I'm sharing these stories because I deeply believe that true faith does not fear the truth. As a former priest, I feel a sacred responsibility to give voice to those who have been systematically silenced for generations. These women dedicated their entire lives to God and the Church, only to be betrayed by a system designed not to protect souls, but to preserve financial assets and the reputation of an institution. Each untold story represents not only a devastating personal injustice, but a collective failure of our most fundamental spiritual values. The same Church that preaches compassion and justice cannot simultaneously operate such a brutal system of silencing against its own devoted servants. The documents I shared today are just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of stories waiting to be told, hundreds of voices waiting to be heard. And for every woman who manages to escape this system, dozens remain trapped in its relentless mechanism. If you know any nun or ex-nun who faced similar situations, please share this video with them discreetly. I created a secure communication channel through which they can share their stories with the guarantee of absolute anonymity. The code to access this channel is in the first comments of this video. The sky is starting to lighten outside. I need to end this broadcast and get moving before the day progresses. After weeks of constant vigilance, I will finally have a few hours to rest, but first I need to go out and hunt for something to feed myself. Isolation in these mountains takes its toll, but the distance from everything gives me the security I need to continue this work. Leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Each additional person who learns of these stories is a small victory against centuries of institutional silence. The truth, however painful, is the only path to any genuine reform.